Hi, this is Ron Cipcic, and this is the third part of a six-part series where we'll be using aggregate demand and aggregate supply modeling to look at macroeconomic issues. In this third segment, we're going to take a look at the Keynesian view of the macroeconomy, specifically when the macroeconomy is experiencing weak aggregate demand, or what we called earlier a contractionary demand shock. And it's important to realize the historical, or understand the historical perspective behind the Keynesian view. John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, wrote a book called The General Theory in 1936, and this is after the worst of the Great Depression. And Keynes proposed that because of the experience of the Great Depression, that markets are not always self-correcting mechanisms. Remember that the classical economists believe that markets adjust, that wages and prices move freely, that markets are efficient, and that whether we're in good times or bad, markets are adjusting to the ongoing conditions. According to Keynes, this is true when times are good, but when times are bad, you may have wage rigidity. And in fact, Keynes talked about sticky wages, wages being sticky downward. In other words, workers are willing to take pay increases, but workers are seldom ready to take pay cuts, and that in fact pay cuts are very painful for workers. It's also important to remember that Keynes is writing in 1936 at a time when the union movement was at its peak, was at its zenith. And if you probably had talked to Keynes back in the early 30s, he probably would tell you that he would foresee a future where most U.S. workers, most British workers, most workers in the industrialized world would be unionized. Now, in fact, that hasn't come to pass. The union movement really hit its peak in the 30s and 40s and actually began to wane after that, particularly in the private sector. Most of the growth today in unions is in the public sector, for instance, teacher unions or service worker unions in the government, for instance, cafeteria workers, let's say. These are the types of workers that are often unionized today, and most of them are in government. But the point is, Keynes foresaw a world where there would be wage rigidity downward. Unions generally will fight tooth and nail against pay cuts, and oftentimes will choose layoffs versus pay cuts. And Keynes also envisioned a world where even non-union workers would be reluctant to take pay cuts, that it's difficult for workers to accept pay cuts, and when forced to take pay cuts, workers will often want to prorate their productivity, in other words, not work as hard. It's very interesting as well that many times employers are reluctant to give workers pay cuts. They would rather lay off workers, particularly workers they consider marginal, during bad times, because they don't want to offend their most prized and valuable workers. And so employers many times don't want to give workers pay cuts. They would prefer to lay off what they consider to be the least productive part of their labor force. And so wage rigidity is very much an issue. And according to Keynes, if in fact workers are reluctant to take pay cuts, you do not get that downward shift or that rightward shift in the aggregate supply curve that we showed in segment 2. Now this leads Keynes to the conclusion that government should play an active role in stabilizing output at its natural rate. So Keynes, it's very important, Keynes has been, I think, misrepresented by many people, particularly by classical conservative types of people, both economists and politicians. Keynes has been portrayed as socialistic or anti-capitalism, but in fact Keynes was not an anti-capitalist. In fact, he had made millions of dollars in the British stock market. The capitalistic system had been very, very good to him. Keynes simply argued that markets aren't always efficient, and particularly when it comes to wages, that wages, yes, they go up fairly easily, but they don't come down very easily. Okay? So it's this wage rigidity that bothered Keynes and led him to propose that government needs to play an active role in stabilizing the system. And I'm going to show you how that would work, how the Keynesian view looks in just a moment. Okay? So this idea that Keynes is anti-capitalism is probably not a fair portrayal of it. Now there have been, I'm sure, socialists and Marxists who have taken Keynesian ideas and have used them for their own promotion of command systems. But we don't really find anywhere in Keynes's writing a strong advocacy for socialism, communism, or what we would otherwise think of as command systems. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the Keynesian view, specifically how that would look in aggregate in the world of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, so I'm going to use a couple colors here as I did last time, and let's say that the aggregate demand curve slides to the left. Okay, so the aggregate demand curve slides to the left. As we have said in our first two segments, this is called a contractionary demand shock. So the aggregate demand curve slides to the left, and this is going to put downward pressure on prices. Prices are going to begin to fall. This is called deflation, and output is going to fall below its natural rate. Again, keep in mind the natural rate of output is always held constant in the short run. So what we're talking about is output falling really below its potential. Now keep in mind that when output falls below its potential, what are we saying? We're saying that there's an increase in unemployment. So there's going to be an increase in unemployment. Specifically, there's going to be an increase in what we call cyclical unemployment. Remember, the cyclically unemployed are people who have skills, they want to work, they have the skills and or values to find work. They can be gainfully employed, but they are not employed because of weak business conditions. Many of them will be laid off during weak and again, it's very important to realize too that cyclical unemployment is generally across sectors. It's not going to be one or two sectors in the system that are changing. That's generally related to structural unemployment. What we're going to be seeing here is we're going to be seeing layoffs and softness in just about all employment markets. Okay, so the classical response to this, as we talked about in segment 2, would be that workers would take pay cuts and this aggregate supply curve would shift to the right, and then prices would fall further, but output would begin to push back up towards its natural rate, this self-correcting mechanism. But in Keynes's world, this isn't necessarily going to occur. In fact, Keynes argued that, he was quoted as saying, we're all dead in the long run, that in fact waiting around for workers to take pay cuts is like waiting to die. The point is, it's too painful to wait. Keynes advocated government action, and you go, well, what would that look like? Well, in Keynes's world, the government would be the demander of last resort. In other words, the government would work to push the aggregate demand curve back to the right. Okay, so in Keynes's world, the government would step in and stimulate aggregate demand. In other words, if aggregate demand is weak, government must step in and somehow stimulate aggregate demand. Now I'll show you how this works in just a minute, but let's suppose that government is able to stimulate aggregate demand. Well, you can see what that would do. It would push prices back up to where they were, and it would push output back up to the natural rate. So according to Keynes, if the problem is weak demand, it's government's responsibility to stimulate the economy. And you've probably heard the term stimulus package or stimulus programs. Well, stimulus refers to stimulating aggregate demand when it's weak. And according to Keynes, there would be two basic ways to do this. The government could increase its spending, or the government could decrease taxes. Now, I'll talk about each of these in just a minute and show you how these would work. But both of those policies fall under the heading of expansionary, fiscal policy. And of course, this would be done by the federal government. In Keynes's world, it's the federal government or national government that is responsible for this. And in the United States, that would mean that Congress would have to pass a spending increase or a tax cut. The president would have to sign off on the bill. And in other words, in the United States, fiscal policy is actually in the hands of Congress, not in the hands of one person. It's not in the hands of the president. Presidents talk as if they control these things, but it's actually, the Constitution actually gives Congress the right to increase government spending, decrease government spending, raise taxes, cut taxes. So fiscal policy is within the purview of the Congress. And that makes it messy. Okay, democracy is messy. And a lot of times people get frustrated with how slow things happen in Washington. But we need to understand that most of that slowness was designed by the framers of the Constitution, that they designed a government with many checks and balances. And really, if you want to be truthful about it, the president has very few economic powers. Most of the president's power lies in the area of commander-in-chief. The president can wage war. Of course, even today, the president is supposed to run that by Congress. But to declare war, the president is obligated to get Congress's approval. But presidents wage wars without declaring war all the time. So the point I'm trying to make is that fiscal policy in a democracy is not always an easy thing to pull off. All right, and that's a real issue, implementation. But we'll just drive by those issues right now and just talk about the theory and what Keynes proposed. So what ends up happening is the economy moves from point 1 to point 2, but government steps in and stimulates demand and moves the system back to point 3. So point 1 and point 3 are actually the same point. Okay? Now, let's take a look briefly at how this would work. Let's look at each of these policies and talk about how expansionary fiscal policy works. Let me go back to black here. It's a little easier to look at. So one of our fiscal policies would be for the government to increase its spending. Okay? Now, remember, aggregate demand is equal to C plus I planned plus G plus X minus M. Earlier in the course, we've talked about this being total planned expenditures. So aggregate demand is really total planned expenditures. Now really what the government wants to do here is it wants to increase its spending without decreasing or negatively impacting other categories of spending. So the game is for the government to boost its spending without crowding out or pushing down any of these other categories. If the government can do that, if it can push its spending up without decreasing other categories of spending, it can move aggregate demand. You know, much has been made of what brought the United States out of the Great Depression, and just as there's a lot of debate about what caused it and what factors played most heavily in those causes, there's also a lot of debate about what brought the United States out of the Great Depression. Actually, if you look at the data, the entire 1930s, that entire decade was very, very slow. Of course, 1929 to 1933 were the worst years, and the economy begins to grow again in 1934. But you actually have very, very slow growth throughout the rest of the 30s. And many economists actually believe it was a decade-long depression. And many people believe that it was actually World War II that brought the United States out of the Great Depression. When the U.S. militarized, government spending just went through the roof. Wars are very, very expensive. And when wars are fought, everyone gets the opportunity to work. Now, you don't really get to choose what you do. You know, soldiers are being drafted. They're being drafted to fight. Many soldiers are enlisting as a result of being moved by patriotism. But the point is, you know, as these soldiers in World War II went off to Europe and then off to the Pacific, many women came in and began to work in factories. So you had very, very high participation rates. Many Americans were working, and those people who were entering the labor force were finding work. There was plenty of work to do. And unemployment was very, very low during World War II. Output rates were very, very, very high. However, let's keep in mind, you know, lest you think that wars are good for the economy, People can be working and people can be earning a good income, relatively speaking, but what do they spend their money on? Most of the production was for the war. It was very difficult during World War II to get many food items. It was difficult to get clothing. It was difficult. You couldn't buy new automobiles. All of that automobile production had been converted over to tank and airplane production and production of jeeps and things like that. Many factories were turned into ammunition factories. The point I'm trying to make is wars are not, even though wars may boost output and reduce unemployment, and they may be necessary. I actually believe that World War II was necessary. It was important to stop Adolf Hitler and Germany in World War II and to stop the Japanese in the Pacific. But the point is, we needed to defend ourselves, but people who were working work usually to earn income, and they want income so they can buy the things they want to enjoy in life, and many of those things were not available during World War II. So World War II was an extreme case of fiscal policy, where the government basically marshals all of the resources to fight a war effort, and certainly G went up a lot, aggregate demand went up a lot, and the economy was very stimulated, although we can easily argue that many Americans couldn't actually buy many of the things they had grown accustomed to. All right, well, now, how do you finance an increase in G? Well, let's go back to circular flow, complex circular flow. Government spending can be financed basically two ways. G equals T plus B, taxes plus borrowing. So if you want to increase G, but you don't want to raise T, and the reason you don't want to raise T is you don't want to decrease C or I. So if you have to keep taxes constant, you don't want to raise taxes because that will decrease C and I and at least partially offset the effect of the increase in G. So what you see here then, it's very simple math. If the government is going to spend more, but it's not going to raise taxes to pay for that increase in spending, it's got to be willing to borrow more. And so this, very fundamental to Keynesian thinking, is the idea of deficit spending. Spending financed by borrowing. Now, in fairness to Keynes, Keynes advocated, if you read his work, you're going to learn that Keynes advocated deficits during bad times, which in the United States are relatively infrequent, and he advocated balanced budgets and surpluses during good times. So Keynes did not advocate the kinds of deficit spending we see today at the federal level, where every year the government is running huge deficits and running up a large national debt. But Keynes did advocate that just as we would be willing to run deficits during wartime, we should be willing to run deficits during periods of economic weakness. In other words, we should view them as economic wars that need to be won. Okay? So the idea of deficit spending, where the government would consciously engage in deficit spending to boost aggregate demand, that's a very Keynesian idea. All right, let me keep it moving here. The second tool now is going to be fairly easy to understand after we've explained the first one. Get my writing tool working here. So we don't want red, we want black. And sorry about that. And we want a little technical difficulty here. So let's erase that. And that blackout was a temporary flaw in the operator of the software system, which is me. Okay, so I just did it again. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay, there we go. So, number 2, a decrease in taxes. Now, how would this work? Well, again, aggregate demand equals C plus I planned plus G plus X minus M. And here the idea would be if we can cut taxes, either on households or on businesses, what can we do? We can boost consumption, or we could boost investment. But in boosting consumption or investment, or both, private spending, this is an increase in private spending, we'd want to keep public spending, government spending constant, and we would not want to negatively impact net exports. Okay? So the idea is we have to be able to cut T without decreasing G. And if we can do that, we can boost aggregate demand, stimulate aggregate demand. So here, the emphasis is on increasing private spending to increase aggregate demand. So tax cuts that actually promote greater spending in the short run are Keynesian. Okay? Now, not all tax cuts are Keynesian. If you cut the taxes of wealthy people, who pay most of the taxes, by the way, yeah, most of the income taxes are paid by wealthy people. They pay far and away most of the income taxes. If you cut the taxes, though, of wealthy, the problem you have, though, is if you cut the taxes of wealthy people who pay most of the taxes, they're likely to save most of it. Now, that may end up stimulating the system anyway, because if they save it and then somebody borrows it and spends it, it still gets spent. But the point I'm trying to make is if you cut the taxes of wealthy people, you may not get much of an increase in spending. So the idea would be to try to cut the taxes of people who would turn around and spend the tax cut. And that becomes tricky business in a progressive tax system where lower income people generally don't pay much in income taxes. It's hard to stimulate the spending of the poor with a tax cut when they're not paying much in the way of taxes. Very interesting idea. All right, anyway, but in Keynes's world, you could cut taxes, and that would stimulate aggregate demand by stimulating private spending. Now, how is this going to work? Well, G equals T plus B. But G is not going to change. T is going to be cut to boost private spending. Well, how can you keep G constant and cut T? Well, once again, you have to engage in what? You have to engage in what is called deficit spending. Now again, in fairness to Keynes, maybe you're conservative and you're more classical and you want to jump all over Keynes for this, but keep in mind Keynes advocated deficits during tough economic times. He didn't advocate deficits year in and year out during bad times and good times. All right, that concludes the Keynesian view of how to deal with a contractionary demand shock.